Government bills. This Council resumes the second reading debate on the Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendments Bill 2018. The Honourable Alice Mack, Chairman of the Bills Committee on the bill, will first address the Council on the Bills Committee's report. The Honourable Alice Mack. Madam Deputy, as Chairman of the Bills Committee on Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendment Bills 2018, I make a report of the deliberation of the bill here. The Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendment Bill 2018, or the bill, seeks to amend the Sex Discrimination Ordinance Cap 480, Disability Ordinance Cap 487, and Race Discrimination Ordinance Cap 602 to widen the scope of protection under these ordinances and to remove the requirement of the intention to discriminate for making an award of damages for certain acts of indirect discrimination under SDO, RDO, FSDO. The Bills Committee has held 5 meetings. Members are concerned about the prohibition discrimination on the ground of breastfeeding, the protection and scope available, protection from harassment on the ground of breastfeeding, prohibition of harassment against participants of the same workplace, scope of protection and coverage of harassment on the grounds of disability and race, prohibiting harassment by clubs, and application of anti-discrimination ordinances in the West Kowloon Station mainland port area. Clause 7 of the bill proposes to introduce a new Section 8A to SDO prohibiting direct and indirect discrimination against a woman on the ground of breastfeeding. Under the proposed new Section 8A2A, a woman would be breastfeeding if she's engaged in the act of breastfeeding her child or expressing breast milk to feed a child, or is a person who feeds her child with her breast milk. Some members have raised concerns as to whether the legislative intent of the proposed new Section 8A is to protect breastfeeding women, in general only breastfeeding mothers. Members of the view that the scope of protection for breastfeeding women against discrimination should not be limited to women who feed their own children with their breast milk. The administration has advised that the policy intent behind this proposed new section is that a woman who chooses to discharge her responsibility as a mother by way of feeding her child with her breast milk should be protected. In light of members' views, the administration has reviewed the proposed definition of breastfeeding and agreed to propose amendments to Clause 7 of the bill by removing the references to her child and substituting the reference of a child. There is a further view that Part 2 of the bill will not afford sufficient protection to breastfeeding women from being harassed or vilified. Quite a number of members have strongly suggested that the administration should draw reference from similar legislation of overseas jurisdictions and consider expanding the scope of protection under the proposed SDO amendments so as to also cover acts of harassment, vilification, and offensive behavior towards breastfeeding women in general. The administration has explained that at present, acts of harassment, vilification, and offensive behavior towards women are handled by various legal means. However, from a policy point of view, protection from harassment afforded by SDO only applies to sexual harassment, although the government is of the view that there should be protection for all women. If protection from harassment on the ground of breastfeeding is to be introduced under SDO, alteration to the overall scope or concept of harassment, including the concept of sexual harassment under SDO, will be inevitable. The administration takes the view that any such amendments would fall outside the scope of the bill for the purposes of Rule 57(4)A of the Rules of Procedure of LegCo. After careful consideration of members' views and concerns, the administration agrees to introduce a separate bill to amend SDO for the purpose of prohibiting harassment on the ground of breastfeeding. We welcome the administration's acceptance of our suggestion and support its proposal to introduce a separate bill. Part 5 of the bill, clauses 19 to 23, seeks to amend SDO, DDO, RDO to make it unlawful for a person who is a workplace participant to harass another person who is also a workplace participant at a common workplace, even in the absence of employment or employment-like relationship between the two participants. Under the proposed new provisions, workplace participant will be defined to mean an employee, an employer, a contract worker or his principal, a commission agent or his principal, or a partner in a firm. The majority of the Bills Committee members support the proposed prohibition of sexual disability and racial harassment in a common workplace. Some members have sought clarification as to whether the definition of workplace participant covers volunteers, unpaid trainees, interns, freelancers, self-employed persons, and outsourced service workers. Members are also concerned as to whether the expanded protection under the bill from sexual disability and racial harassment would apply in situations where the harasser and the victim are present in a common workplace but do not have any employment or employment-like relationship with each other. According to the administration, protection from harassment in a common workplace would apply among workplace participants within the meaning of the relevant provisions in Part 5 of the bill, but not to all persons present in the workplace premises. The capacities referred to by members which are not expressly mentioned in the bill may be protected by relevant provisions of Part 5 of the bill if they fall within any of the categories of persons within the proposed definition of workplace participant in their given circumstances. Members still have concern that there may be persons working in or attending a workplace as interns or volunteers whose provision of service or labor may not satisfy the definition of employment and thus fall outside the scope of the proposed protection. The administration, therefore, has agreed to move amendments to the bill to expressly include intern and volunteer in the proposed definition of workplace participant in Part 5 of the bill, so as to provide more comprehensive protection from harassment in the workplace. Concern has been raised as to whether the definition of club in the 4 anti-discrimination ordinances covers churches and religious facilities and whether the proposed protection relating to harassment by clubs would extend to cover pastoral staff and congregation participating in religious activities in churches and religious facilities such that they would have legal protection against sexual or disability harassment. According to the administration, Part A of the bill proposes to amend SDO and DDO by introducing provisions similar to Section 3910 of RDO, rendering it unlawful for a club, the committee of management of a club, or member of the committee of management of a club to harass a person who is or has applied to be a member of the club or relevant person. If an organization formed for religious purposes satisfies the definition of club, it would be unlawful for any member of the club or any member of the group or body of persons responsible for managing the affairs of the organization to sexually harass a relevant person or to harass a relevant person with a disability. There is concern as to whether proceedings against any persons on the grounds of sexual disability and racial harassment, discrimination in a common workplace under SDO, DDO, and RDO would fall within the scope of matters pertaining to the contractual or other legal relationships of a civil nature among the bodies or individuals as particularized in Article 7.5 of the Cooperation Arrangement between the mainland and the Hong Kong SAR on the establishment of the port at the West Kowloon Station of the Guangzhou-Shenzhen Hong Kong Express Rail Link for implementing co-location arrangement, and thus will be regarded as reserved matters under the Guangzhou-Shenzhen Hong Kong Express Rail Link Co-location Ordinance Cap 632. In the administration's view, depending on the circumstances of each case, claims under the 4 anti-discrimination ordinances are matters pertaining to the contractual or other legal relationship of civil nature under Article 7.5 of the Cooperation Arrangement. Upon passage of the bill, the legal protection afforded by relevant proposed amendments therein would likewise apply to the bodies or individuals in the Cooperation Amendment. The administration will move amendments to the bill to clarify the definition of breastfeeding and to include interns and volunteers into the definition of workplace participants to offer more comprehensive protection. The Bills Committee has no objection to these amendments. Now, after my report of the Bills Committee, I would like to state my own views on the bill. FTU is all for enacting legislation to protect breastfeeding women in the workplace. Many mothers have chosen to breastfeed their child because there can be benefits for both mother and child, and the baby can absorb natural antibodies to enhance their health. According to WHO, breastfeeding should last for at least half year. Unfortunately, we've only got 10 weeks of maternity leave. After much lobbying by FTU, the period is likely to be extended to 14 weeks. However, that is still too short for breastfeeding. So after her maternity leave, a mother will have to express breast milk to feed her child, and we have to provide legal protection for such a women against any discrimination. At first, the administration just wanted to cover women feeding their own children. However, some mothers have sufficient breast milk to help each other out by sharing breast milk in bodies like mothers group. So some women may like to help a fellow mother and and they may not be protected under the original bill. So that will cause pressure to bear on breastfeeding mothers. So we urge the administration to expand the scope of breastfeeding so that the protection will not just be offered to mother breastfeeding her own child. So in Clause 7 of the bill, there will be an amendment. So instead of her child, it will be replaced by the word a child to enhance the scope of protection. We welcome this amendment from the administration. So we hope that the bill can give due protection to all breastfeeding women. So if a breastfeeding mother is subject to harassment or vilification, she may not be protected under the original or under this bill. So the administration is willing to move a separate bill to prohibit harassment or vilification on the ground of breastfeeding. According to the administration, they are going to draw reference from provisions related to harassment in Part 2 of SDO, DDO, and RDO. We welcome the acceptance of the government of our suggestion. We hope that amendment bill can be introduced as soon as possible to give greater protection to our breastfeeding mothers. You may recall a case when a mother had nowhere to breastfeed her child, so she had to do it on a taxi, but then the act was videotaped and circulated online. So that was a kind of harassment. Our intention is to protect all women. We hope the administration can enact the legislation as soon as possible to give the greatest level of protection to mothers. Well, Hong Kong is a tense place, and mother has to return to her workplace 2 months after delivery, and breastfeeding will add to the stress. Now, we cannot just protect a breastfeeding mother from discrimination by means of a bill. Not all offices have got a nursing room, and during the BC deliberations, a female colleague asked whether we had sufficient facilities in this council. Not all offices have got a fridge. There might not be sufficient storage for expressed milk. So to protect our breastfeeding women, legislation should be coupled with publicity so that everyone understands the needs of breastfeeding mothers, and they can also be sympathetic to the needs of their female employees. For SDO, DDO, and RDO at workplace, the definition of workplace participants do not cover volunteers and interns. After detailed discussion, the administrators agree to add volunteer and intern to the definition of participants in Part 5 of the bill to offer more comprehensive protection. Again, this is supported by the FTU. When we started the scrutiny of the bill, there were diverse views within the Bills Committee. We all felt that protection for breastfeeding female employees were not sufficient. The government was able to maintain an open mind and incorporated views from BC members and make corresponding amendments. The government has undertaken to move a separate bill for further amendment of discrimination-related ordinances. We are, in general, happy with the response from the administration. This is, we have had a very healthy and constructive discussion. Because the electrical building was vandalized, so a few meetings were cancelled. But whenever we were able to meet, the administration was able to engage in a rational, peaceful, and healthy discussion with the Bills Committee. We very much hope that this spirit can be extended to all other meetings of the Council. And this is beneficial to the community and an effective and efficient way of using meeting time. We want to thank members and also the Secretary for their support to the Bills Committee, and we thank the administration team for willing to accept our views and listen to our views with an open mind so that the outcome of the Bills Committee is desirable. We urge the administration to further amend the related legislation as soon as possible to give more protection to our to our breastfeeding mothers. Call for quorum.
黃碧雲議員。
Dr. Helen Wang. Please turn your phone to vibration mode, or silent mode, rather. President, today I speak to support the discrimination legislation Miscellaneous Amendment Bill 2018 and to support the amendments moved. I'm also part of the Bills Committee and has long been concerned about the anti-discrimination legislation. Well, this bill hopes to enhance the protection by the 4 discrimination ordinances. Well, even though I support the amendments, it doesn't mean that this bill is flawless, which is not the case. Put it this way, on promoting equal opportunity and anti-discrimination, for the past 2 decades or so, the government have been very passive and moved at a glacial pace. The anti-discrimination ordinance, as the Hong Kong Bill of Rights has been adopted in Hong Kong, and a few years before the handover, we can see that the equal opportunity and this anti-discrimination legislation start enacting. That's not led by the government, but instead written by Anna Wu, where she tabled our private members' bill for a raft of anti-discrimination ordinance. I have looked at those bills myself. I remembered there was a huge yellow folder where the anti-discrimination legislation cover the whole lot. For example, banning sexual discrimination, disability discrimination, age discrimination, race discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination, and also banning discrimination due to the union, religious, political, and organization background, which will make them subject to unfair treatment. Well, looking back at her private members' bill, I see her move was courageous. Even though we moved the private members' bill, the government response, they are opposed to them. They were reluctant to take on that. And finally, I see the public are positive to enacting anti-legislation laws. After much controversy, the government decided telling Ms. Wu to withdraw her private members' bill because it's very difficult for a private members' bill to move anyway without the government support. And finally, the government have taken 2 aspects out of Ms. Wu's bill. For example, gender discrimination and disability discrimination. And these are the 2 discrimination ordinances that's first enacted before the reunification. And later on, you also have this race RDO and the family status discrimination ordinance. So it's been over 20 years since the reunification. We still only have 4 anti-discrimination laws. The government has been reluctant to act. Well, finally, by much nudging by the members, they finally take it on piecemeal. And 20 years on, we still have only 4 anti-discrimination laws. And due to the government's reluctance, this 4 anti-discrimination law in its drafting had a very narrow scope, either limited to education and employment services on the service provided, have the area very constricted so that as much powers is very much constrained. And many years, there are many NGOs and many others have clamored for a review and amendment. And why would the government reluctant to take up sexual orientation discrimination? We have Mr. Ray Chan here today. We have proposed it many times to the government and claimed that we keep reviewing and reviewing and try to put aside controversial legislation. That's still their attitude. Now that we get to this stage, but why are we having this bill? Because the Equal Opportunity Commission, well, that's established under this various anti-discrimination ordinance, and the statutory body, well, after 20 years, in 2016, in March, they had published the Discrimination Law Review Report, and they cited the problems in the implementation, for example, the insufficient protection or inconsistency. Thus, they have offered 73 recommendations, and out of these 73, they wish the government to adopt all of them. And out of the 73, they also prioritized them, of which 27 are considered of higher priority. Out of 73, the 27 of those, the AOC see that at high priority, but the government were willing to take on this 27. Of this 27, the government further cherry-picked. As for the government's long-standing approach, they will need to examine the complexity, the level of controversy. For anything the controversy is complicated, they will put that aside. Even though that the EOC have made forward such recommendations, and so do a lot of NGOs and legislators. And finally, out of these 27 prioritized recommendations, the government had finally settled on the 9. So out of 73, your 27 high priority, out of 27, you finally whittled down to 9. Of the 9, and finally you have get rid of one more. You will need to wait longer. That's will cover the subdivided units. We're protecting those are sharing the same premises or the harassment between the tenants and subtenants. The government will consider taking it on board, but finally see that as complicated and decide warrant further study. Thus, they get rid of that and only 8 left. And this 8 recommendations is manifested in this bill on table. So that's why I'm giving you the history of why we need to amend this ordinance, because it's been deficient in the start when it's drafting, that with area very constricted and offer inadequate protection. And the government was gravely concerned it would cause controversy, or it's been too complicated, thus been keep dragging on its feet. Well, the government is not wholeheartedly want to push for equal opportunity society, or to really serious on cracking down on discriminative acts. Well, the Democratic Party will support his amendments, and yet you have a long list still to deliver. And for the first amendment, it's related to the direct and indirect discrimination on breastfeeding. The Democratic Party have support and encouraging the breastfeeding, which you see as beneficial to mother and child. Even though we support this amendment, however, we still see that while encouraging breastfeeding, the policy and the legislation and the support have yet to come into place, which included the maternity leave. Currently only stand at 10 weeks. I hope that you can extend it to 14 weeks. Well, a lot of the new mothers are willing to try breastfeeding. Well, only 10 weeks, so however, they will need to get to work soon. And once you get back to work, it's difficult. Well, in your workplace, your boss may not allow you to express milk or let alone bring your baby to work. While expressing breast milk would be subject to discrimination or obstructed, or whether you have a suitable venue, or whether they have a small fridge to store this breast milk. Well, besides the legislation, there's a lot of work or catch-up to be done. And sometimes we see the mothers complaining in public places, in restaurants and shopping centers, while they try to breastfeed, they don't know what to do because there are a lot of discriminating glances and harassment, and some of them stop the mother breastfeeding and advise them to do breastfeeding in the bathroom. Would you actually have your meals in the bathroom? And also those the premise managers have no idea or awareness of such. I hope that by banning the indirect discrimination or direct discrimination of breastfeeding, by adding a new section 8A, which I see as some slight improvement. Well, this law is yet to offer full protection for breastfeeding women, so that will not be subject to harassment or vilification. While examining the laws, Mr. Ted Hui have been adamant. Besides this new 8A, it also be express provision that should not harass a breastfeeding women for any vilification or offensive behavior. In other jurisdictions, including Australia and the UK, they have laws requiring that the breastfeeding mother is not subject to any form of harassment. However, in this bill, we're not able to tackle this. We only managed to ban the direct and indirect discrimination of breastfeeding women. For the harassment, we're not able to tackle through this bill. The government said they will move a separate bill that we'll table to legislate later. But now that we're at the end of the term, they probably would do that at the next term. Well, as we're not able to ban the harassment breastfeeding women within this term, the government expressed a great regret. I hope the government could make good on the promise and to submit this bill to legislate as soon as possible. And there are some parts of this bill, and for example, on the outlawing harassment in the workplace, I support the government in moving the relevant amendments. Well, for the SDO and the RDO, for often we said about the banning the Discrimination and Harassment Act in the workplace, but only limited to employment-like relationship. If they're not in an employment relationship, it would not be given protection. For this amendment, that defining the workplace participant besides the contract worker and the principal and the employee and the partner in the firm will also count as a workplace participant, and banning harassment among those parties, whether for racial or family status and sex discrimination. There's still a loophole though. We overlooked that within the same workplace there may be other types of people, for example volunteers and interns. Well, after I state my case, I know the government finally had taken my views on board, and now the government has moved that amendment that the workplace participant, the protection will be afforded to interns and outsourced workers and volunteers. And for other parts that we're not able to mention here, well, the government had yet to deliver on several things. First, on the sexual harassment among different schools, which is not covered in this bill. To only help those under the same school, for example, encouraging the teacher and the students free from sexual harassment. Well, however, for the sexual harassment occurring among different institutions, that's not covered. That's much regretful. Hope that the government continue to follow with this. So submit.
Mr. Chen Chi-chin. Today we resume the second reading debate of the Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendments Bill 2018. And this is now for 2 weeks in a row, the new Secretary for Constitution and Mainland Affairs have to come to this council to deal with bills. Last week it was the National Anthem Bill. This week this is the Discrimination Legislation Amendment, Miscellaneous Amendment Bill 2018. My position is very different from that of last week. I can tell you categorically that I support this bill and all the CSAs the administration is going to move at the committee stage. We believe the government should have done more and faster when it comes to protection against discrimination. Now, we are very eager. We have been urging the administration for a few years because we can never feel the pain suffered by the disadvantaged or the vulnerable, such as the discrimination against sexual orientation discrimination, and now I am homosexual, but for those the transgender, you may never feel the pain they're suffering. Even enacting a piece of legislation may not help them to resolve their problems, but at least when we have a piece of legislation, that means we have a benchmark in society. It can also serve an education purpose to ensure that the community will not discriminate against such people. Now, this bureau is responsible for constitutional and mainland affairs, is also responsible for elections, and its fourth area of work is human rights, which is within the ambit of this bill. Now, for the CMAB, I would say that it has done very little to advance human rights in Hong Kong. Now, everyone in Hong Kong has got his human rights being trampled on. We always say that the power of the police is expanding indefinitely. Now, if we look at the rights of the disadvantaged, perhaps it is a luxury to talk about their human rights, but at least we are willing to accept whatever the government is willing to do. So this bill is called Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendments Bill 2018. I'd like to mention or to comment on two aspects. First, 2018, whereas today is June 2020. So this bill was introduced or was gazetted in late November 2018, and it received its first reading in this council in December 2018. I hope the pro-establishment camp will not talk about the anti-extradition bill saga and also the COVID-19 make it impossible for us to consider the bill. No, in fact, the bill itself is not complicated. It is called miscellaneous amendments because it seeks to amend provisions in 4 anti-discrimination ordinances. Now, there is some prohibition of discrimination on the ground of breastfeeding. Now, we used to say that the anti-discrimination ordinances are toothless tiger because you can't really prosecute an offender because most of the disputes are resolved by means of mediation. Even the Equal Opportunities Commission is not too willing to take a case to the court. Usually, it will go for mediation. Now, I'd like to spend some time to talk about the background of the case. It can be dated back to 2014. When there was a public consultation on the anti-discrimination ordinances, it was an ambitious public consultation, inviting views from the public on our existing anti-discrimination ordinances, what can be amended and what can be further done. And we hope that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation can be tackled. Now, we asked that equal rights legislation or ordinance could be used, embracing all kinds of discrimination. 125,000 submissions were received during the 2014 public consultation. And then the consultation ended in 2016, and then the review report was published in March 2018. That was done by the former chairman, Dr. York Chow of EOC, and he has seen 2 successes already. There were 73 recommendations contained in the recommendation in the report. Of course, if you ask, EOC understands that it's impossible to implement all 73 recommendations at the same time. So it has chosen 27 recommendations for introduction as a priority. And among the 27, the government chose 9 prioritized recommendations. And that is the reason why we have the Miscellaneous Amendments Bill here. So these 9 recommendations were chosen by the administration, but then the government added a 10% discount again. So one proposal was to amend SDO, DDO, RDO to ensure that tenants and subtenants would not be subject to harassment by co-tenants or co-subtenants of the same premises that would deal with the scenario of subdivided units. That one has been removed. Perhaps it's because of the legal definition, claiming that there need to be further clarification. So this recommendation has been dropped. There is no promise as to when it can be reintroduced. So this is not a very controversial bill. The consultation was in 2014, and then it's only in 2020 that it received its second reading. So you can see how long the journey can be. Of course, the government would talk about removing the controversies. Well, the Fugitive Offenders Bill first came to light in February, and then it was supposed to receive its second reading on the 12th of June, ordered by Andrew Leung. So it depends on whether you have the will. If you want to avoid anything controversial, then you can do nothing at all. Of course, people claim that there is no discrimination or there's been reverse discrimination and ask you to drop the proposals. So when you claim that there are too many controversies in society, so you would rather not do it to avoid disputes. Among the 73 recommendations, 27 have been chosen, and only 8 were in the bill. And we spent 6 years from public consultation to second reading. So would it take you more than 50 years for 73 recommendations to be completed? Mind you, those 73 recommendations are not aggressive ones. So for this bill, there are 2 major scopes. First, to enhance protection for breastfeeding women. Second is to improve protection for harassment at workplace, and also miscellaneous items. We may not have time to deal with all of them. Now, there is protection for associates to be free from vilification or harassment, so that relatives of ethnic minorities could be protected, and also to protect certain races, and also people who have been assigned or considered a certain race can also be protected. And also, if a vessel has left Hong Kong, is in open seas, whether the legislation can protect them. So we're talking about very minor issues. When it comes to breastfeeding, the government has been promoting breastfeeding in recent years. And of course, even the scientists are saying that breastfeeding is good. It can give antibodies to babies to enhance their immunity. Professor Gabriel Leung of Hong Kong U did a did a study. The longer a baby is breastfed, the healthier it will be. It will have low risk of having high blood hypertension and obesity in later years. So even maternity and child health centers are not distributing samples of baby formula to encourage breastfeeding. But we need all the supporting measures in place before we can encourage more mothers to adopt breastfeeding. So we have amended Section 8.8 so that mothers can breastfeed their children in public free from any discrimination. Of course, the contention is whether we need to be so rigid as to accord protection to women breastfeeding her children only. Now, it involves two issues. How can you confirm that whether a woman is breastfeeding her own child? Do you have to produce your ID card or birth certificate to confirm that, so that you can seek redress when you have suffered discrimination while breastfeeding? Now, if you are helping out, for instance, your sister, will you be protected? So we have to view the definition need not be so strict. Now, if two mothers are breastfeeding, now for woman A, she is breastfeeding her own child, she cannot suffer any discrimination. And for mother B, she is not breastfeeding her own child, so she will not be protected by the law. And this is rather unreasonable, and therefore the administration is going to move a CSA with our support. That is, the definition will be amended by removing the reference to her child and substituting the reference with a child. This is a simple way to ensure the legislative intent is realized. But we are going to chase after you. This bill cannot deal with harassment on the ground of breastfeeding. Harassment can include harassment, vilification, and offensive behavior. The administration has agreed that a separate bill will be introduced to deal with harassment on the ground of breastfeeding. That is to engage in unwelcome behavior and to harass a woman, which a person with common sense would regard it to be insulting. Now, in our BC report, there is this very strange sentence. Regarding the timetable for introducing the separate bill, the administration has pledged to take forward the legislative exercise in an expeditious manner with a view to presenting the separate bill to LegCo for first reading and scrutiny within 2019-2020 legislative session. What is the date today? I'm sure this cannot be possible. I hope in his reply, the Secretary can make it clear that the bill cannot be introduced within this legislative session. And we should promise to move a bill in the next session, at the beginning of the next session, while we run our elections. Can the Secretary please draft this bill? Let's not wait for another year. And for that bill, do not just cover a single item, but some of the 73 recommendations.
Elizabeth Court. President, I speak in support of the Discrimination Legislation Miscellaneous Amendment Bill 2018. And the Women's Committee under the DAB has been promoting breastfeeding for years. And we have noticed that in the course of doing that, many women have raised many problems. And discrimination and harassment have been something that have happened to them very often. That's why the amendment to the legislation has been proposed by the EOC, and that's one of the 8 priority recommendations on prohibition on breastfeeding, and we support this. As to other safeguards that would prohibit racial discrimination in the workplace and so on and so forth, so that would also be supported. So in the course of the scrutiny of this bill, in particular with regard to the definition of breastfeeding, the administration initially said that it's only confined to breastfeeding your own children, and we immediately said that, well, as to how the woman is to use her own milk, that should be determined by she herself, and according to the experience of some breastfeeding women, on some occasions, they would also have to breastfeed other people's babies, and the administration eventually accepted our suggestion, so that even if they were breastfeeding other people's babies, that would also be accepted. And also for interns and also volunteers, they should also be protected. And the administration also accepted our suggestion, and we'd like to welcome that. But then still, it's not able to resolve one of the more serious problems. That is the harassment towards breastfeeding women. All along, we've been asking the administration to deal with that, but then the administration said that to include that in this piece of legislation, it might be more difficult, and therefore they promised that they would be coming up with another piece of legislation that would prohibit discrimination on grounds of breastfeeding. So that's the promise by the administration, and they actually gazetted that. So that would amend the sex discrimination ordinance, and therefore if you harass women breastfeeding children, that would be made an offense. Unfortunately, we would not be able to complete the scrutiny within this term of this council. Therefore, I hope that the administration can promise that during the next term, they would table that piece of legislation before this council as soon as possible, so that we can enact that amendment bill as well. So that for discrimination and harassment towards women who are breastfeeding, there would also be better safeguards, and that would go further to protect women. Concerning the administration's willingness to listen to our views at the Bills Committee stage, and also with regard to the suggestion that I made, they were willing to discuss with us, and they also had many meetings with us, and they also took action to move the amendments, and they were willing to come up with another bill, and that was also gazetted right away. And I hope that we can also give credit to the relevant colleagues and officials, because at other bills committees we might not be able to come across officials that are that willing to discuss things without and solve problems with us. Because very often when the administration came up with came up with bills and so on, they would adopt a very strict jacket approach and they would not be willing to make any changes. And I think this time is a very good experience, and the administration should extend this to other bills so that officials would adopt this kind of approach in discussing bills with us. Because very often we have first-hand experience in contacting our residents, and they have come across different problems, and instead of having officials come up with initiatives behind closed doors, it would be a lot better. And therefore I think that this has been a very good experience. But then whether or not we will have another bill that would prohibit harassing breastfeeding moms, will that be able to resolve all the problems concerning women who are breastfeeding their children? No, that's not the case, because they are still facing a lot of problems. Other than discrimination and harassment, there are other problems. For example, if you'd like to breastfeed your kids, then of course the doctor's suggestion is that you should be doing that for 6 months, but then maternity leave would only last for 10 weeks. Even if we're able to increase that to 14 weeks within this session, it will still not be enough. And upon resumption of work, and if you try to breastfeed your kids, in public places or offices or shopping centers and so on, there is a shortage of such breastfeeding venues, and therefore we've been asking the administration to make it mandatory that for newly built government complexes or public buildings and so on, there should be breastfeeding rooms and so on. And for redeveloped buildings, there should also be such facilities. For example, in this complex, initially we had a lactation rooms, but then it's not very adequate because there was only one room, and many of the facilities are lacking. For example, the ventilation was not good, and there is also no curtain. And therefore, if there are 2 breastfeeding women using the room, that would not be very convenient. And also, there is no charging facilities and so on. And if there is no refrigerators, that would also not be good. But then afterwards, the Secretariat has been willing to set up one more room for such purposes, so that for women working in this building, they would be able to make use of such lactation rooms to breastfeed or to do the expression of milk and so on. But then for other venues or premises, that might not be feasible, and therefore we have the problem of breastfeeding unfriendly premises and so on, and therefore we should provide better support. Well, I hope that the administration on the whole can do more, because they have not been attaching enough importance to this. For example, for women doing breastfeeding, they are facing a lot of discrimination and harassment, and that has been with us for many years. And looking back on how we dealt with this bill, if you look back on history, in fact, back in 2014, 2016, we already did the consultation, and back in 2016, the EOC already submitted recommendations, and there were 73, and of course, it takes a long time to complete everything, and therefore priority has been given to some 27, and that was the view of the EOC, but then the administration was of the view that only 9 were less controversial, and now we have only been vetting some 8. So out of the 27, and what about the remaining ones? So there should be 73 together. So the administration has been saying that it would be attaching a lot of importance to that. Yet when can that be completed? We hope that the administration can work harder, so that for those priority recommendations as recommended by the EOC, when would the administration be able to bring that up for the discussion by the stakeholders and the community, so that we could try and reach a consensus after more discussions, and then we'll be able to further improve our legislative regime. And also on women's policies, there are many pieces of legislation that have got problems. For example, we have been very concerned about sexual violence, for example, for peeping Johns, and also taking pictures using hidden cameras and so on. That has been a very serious problem, and we've been advising that the administration should take action on upskirting, and also on lawyering. And we've been asking that shelters be set up, but then the administration has not been willing to do that in the 5 regions, and therefore we have single moms who have not been able to get maintenance. And for years, we have been asking the administrations to set up a dedicated unit to help these single moms to go after their exes to get maintenance and so on. And also there are problems in relation to bringing up children, and we've been asking the administration to provide breast cancer screening for those over 40. And the only thing that they have been able to do is that for HPV vaccination, that would be provided for free to those over 50. And after years of fighting for that, we have finally managed to get it. So as you can see, for policy or a piece of legislation, from the time when we started to fight for it to the time when we are able to finally implement it, very often it would take some 10 years or even longer. And therefore, we are talking about smart city, and also for a community that is rapidly developing, and the fact that we are lagging behind on many of these areas, we are actually falling very backward behind, and therefore we will have to catch up. So I hope that all the different departments will attach more importance to women's policies, because we're talking about over half of the population being women, and therefore we have to attach more importance to women. Secondly, we will have to come up with more policy discussions instead of just doing some consultation before introducing a bill, so that we can do more of these and then implement that better later. So only then will we be able to fully protect women. That's why for this particular bill, the DAB will support it, and we will also be prepared to support the 2 amendments moved by the administration. These are my remarks.
主席。
Mr. Holden Chow. President, I speak in support of the discrimination legislation Miscellaneous Amendments Bill 2018. The bill actually has been discussed at the EOC, and views have been collected on inadequacies of the ordinances, and some of the less controversial recommendations have been put forward, including a protection for breastfeeding women and for associate people. In the past, for ethnic minorities, when they are discriminated because of their race, it may be only because of their near relatives, but now it would include associated people, those who might work with them or who have a closer relationship with them. I believe that this could better protect ethnic minorities to ensure that they would not be racially discriminated. President, I also need to point out that there are still areas in the 4 anti-discrimination ordinances that have not been covered. And I would like to point it out here so that the administration can give a response. Under the RDO, we see vilification. In the past, we have received complaints. Many people on different occasions, even online, use very strong acts of vilification in their verbal remarks. And we see that for these serious vilification, there is no follow-up law enforcement or prosecution. And I have once raised a written question in the LegCo before. At that time, the administration's response was that there have never been prosecutions on serious vilification cases. And that is really hard to believe. We see online that some people choose to use insulting words to discriminate people of different race. Yet, all these years, we have never seen any successful prosecution. And nobody has ever had to be prosecuted on criminal offense. Does it mean that there is no discrimination without any prosecution cases? No, it only shows that there are still many inadequacies in our law enforcement. I have expressed to the administration on many occasions that on serious vilification, there needs to be prosecution to try to amend the legislation to provide better protection. This is something that the government needs to follow up. President, another area that needs to be explored is that the administration decided to focus on those relatively less complex or controversial issues. I agree with the principle of this action. I know that there are some NGOs or individuals who hope that the scope of the 4 existing anti-discrimination ordinances could be broadened. I also like to speak of my own stance. The sex discrimination ordinance is not included in these 4 ordinances that are to be reviewed because we know that we must respect people of different sexual orientation. But to protect them from discrimination, we need to explore how we could do that. Raising awareness would be a better method because if we want to draw legislation to protect sexual discrimination, we see in Western countries that with legislation it might actually bring back a sort of reverse discrimination. Mr. Holden-Chow, please return to this bill. Well, yes, we have actually discussed this before in the Bills Committee. We do not want to see any reverse discrimination. With legislation of SDO, then we might see a reverse discrimination as occurred in other Western countries. Therefore, we decided to focus solely on these 4 anti-discrimination ordinances and not on sexual orientation discrimination. I believe that this is very appropriate. We must be very careful in the handling of these sensitive issues. I also hope to express another point to the administration. Sometimes people might be discriminated by their place of origin and the language or dialect they speak. we have seen some sort of discrimination or impolite behavior targeted towards these people locally. We have also spoken on this to the administration on different occasions, that the government must also try to stop these from recurring. When we see impolite behavior in which some shops display clearly that they would not allow patronage of those speaking Putonghua. This is a sort of discrimination and is wrong in principle. If we are not encouraging this in the community, the government should also adopt means to stop these discriminations. And right now, there is no effective means to protect these people under our existing ordinances. I hope that the government will be able to consider this in the future. President, I so submit.
Dr. Fernando Zhang. President. Well, sexual orientation discrimination is not under the scope of this bill, but since it's touched on by Mr. Holden Chow, I have to say that we don't share his view. These laws and regulations are there to prevent discrimination from happening, especially on sexual minorities or the minority in general. You legislate to protect them, but you said that you are worried about reverse discrimination. Well, if you are scared of discrimination, then you need to make your voice heard to fight against discrimination. Legislating against gender or sexual orientation discrimination is not the topic here, but I'd like to say that in a lot of advanced economies, they encourage or require different places to legislate to prohibit discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation. This bill is not controversial. It's based on the previous recommendation of the Equal Opportunities Commission. Well, they suggested or recommend legislating against discrimination on the grounds of breastfeeding. We support that. Whether we are trying to fight for women's rights or from the perspective of being family friendly, we will support this bill. Individual members, say Mr. Ted Hui, said that the current proposal does not cover harassment. The administration undertook that they would introduce a separate bill. We don't know when it will come, but we hope that it will be soon. In relation to associated parties that are subject to race discrimination, they propose an enhanced protection. Of course, we support that. Well, the race, maybe someone's race is not the subject of discrimination, but their associate, maybe the wife or relatives, might be subject to race discrimination. It is included in the proposal. We support that. Participants in a common workplace being harassed will be under the scope of the proposal. There will be protection against such thing. Well, previously for a workplace, the law only covers employees and employers. It's rather limited, but now Well, a contract staff that is directly under the employment of the employer, if anything happens to the contract staff, they will be protected. Well, also in relation to the provision of services and facilities, the scope has also been expanded. Previously, if it's a service provider causing harassment to customers, that is currently covered by existing laws. In some workplace, maybe on board a flight, the cabin crew might be harassed by customers. Currently, they are not protected. This is rectified under the proposal. We support that as well. In relation to interns and volunteers in a common workplace, the administration is willing to introduce amendments to expand the scope of protection. We fully agree with that. So I don't think the content of the bill itself is controversial. It's rather the background of the bill. The amendments involving the four pieces of discrimination ordinance, as well as the timing, is a different matter. I remember the review started by Lam Woon Kwong back in 2011. Finally, the report was completed in 2016. The same was submitted to the administration. And then there is another wait till 2020 for the bill to be introduced. As we've heard from a number of members, the EOC touched on over 70 provisions. Well, in this legislative amendment exercise, they've covered about 20. And they have not covered people living in a partitioned flat. So they have taken that from the 89 recommendations, but they've added something else, so it's another addition. But we don't see any timetable for the implementation of the recommendation of the EOC in relation to the other recommendations. We have asked many times in the Bills Committee. The biggest problem in the Race Discrimination Ordinance is that it doesn't prohibit the government in the execution of their functions be subject to this ordinance. The administration said, well, currently there are a lot of safeguards and protections, say in the form of the Basic Law and the Bill of Rights Ordinance. So the bottom line is one should not discriminate against anyone else. There are also international conventions as well. So one should not discrimination against anyone else, including on the grounds of race. Well, we want to materialize the subject matter of the international conventions and these ordinances. If an aggrieved person wants to sue the government, they will not be protected. If a person wants to take the government to the court, they will have to take out a litigation themselves. It is not impossible, but very difficult. Well, for the Bill of Rights ordinance, it is it is more on a principle than actual circumstances. So I would think that there is no actual protection afforded. And it says under Clause 3 that this will also by the government, but there is one line missing, that in the performance of the functions of the government, if they have contravene any of these provisions, it's an offense. That is missing. On a number of occasions, the United Nations asked the Hong Kong SAR government to amend the race discrimination ordinance by adding that on a number of occasions, but these requests have fallen on deaf ear. Back in 2009, when the ordinance came to effect, there was a well-known case. It was a child, 11 years old, and there was an altercation in the street with another member of the public. Both parties reported to the police, saying that there was some pushing and shoving. Well, the police arrested the young girl, but not the other adult. The 11-year-old was detained. The 11-year-old could only speak English. The police arranged for someone who speaks Punjabi as an interpreter. That is, no matter how you slice it, discrimination. The case went to the High Court. The little girl lost her case because the government is not bound by the ordinance. If there had been this amendment, then the whole thing really involving that 11-year-old girl would have been avoided. Of course, now they cherry pick by choosing less controversial recommendations in their proposal. For those core issues where the international community has been reminding them to do it, they drag their feet. Say, in the Disability Discrimination Ordinance, as stated in one of the recommendations of the EOC, they said that reasonable accommodation will have to be put in place. In the exercise of the functions of the government, they have the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. What does that mean? Say, for someone who is physically disabled, if you go to work, however, at the entrance, there is no ramp, then a ramp will have to be added. If the employer employs the disabled person but refuse to add the ramp, then the employer is wrong. Well, this is basically a civil matter. You have to prove that the employer gives you a different treatment because of your, say, disability. But if there is a legal requirement of reasonable accommodation, then the whole thing is different. You are an employer. You have this responsibility. But if you have differential treatment towards disabled people, then you have committed an offense. Well, the aggrieved person will have to prove to the court or the EOC that the other party or the employer has a differential treatment towards you. Well, related organizations they don't have to prove that they have introduced reasonable accommodation for that person. So it's a matter of whether it is a passive or an active approach. You have also excluded prohibition against the harassment of people living in partition flats. In Hong Kong, living space is limited. There may be different households living in the same flat. In such a confined space, there will be a lot of conflict. Sexual harassment is one of them. A concerned group conducted a survey. They said that 21% of the respondents have been subject to sexual harassment to different degrees. Of course, it only covers female residents. It's a very serious problem. Over half of the respondents are worried that they would be sexually harassed in the place they live. It happens every day. They live in fear every single day. If there is the law to give them the protection as soon as possible, if there is an implementing agency to seek justice for them, who would guide them in the lodging of complaint instead of requiring the parties to take the case to the court, it gives a positive message. It tells the public that there is an actual organization or enforcement organization to help them. So you should not break the law. We're happy to see that the administration has taken up some of the recommendation of the EOC, but there is no actual plan to implement all of them. We hope that this is only the first step. I'd like to hear from the Secretary about the timetable of implementation of other recommendations. Thank you.
Dr. K.K. Kwok. Mr. President, it's hard to imagine that for these amendments, in particular, on breastfeeding women's discrimination, and also broadening the scope of the RDO and DDO in terms of the time that we have to wait. Well, just now, Helena Wong already talked about the history to this, and therefore I do not propose to repeat that here. But then, given that we have waited for such a long time for the amendments to be made to these anti-discrimination legislation, okay, we've been waiting for more than 20 years, and only now have we been able to move these amendments to part of those ordinances. What kind of happiness can we claim in achieving this? In fact, when it comes to these anti-discrimination ordinances, the administration for many years has only been doing some review work. But then, unfortunately, when it comes to amendments, they have been adopting this snail's pace in doing what they should have done a long time ago. We are talking about broadening the scope of the coverage of these ordinances, whether it's about racial, disability, or family status discrimination ordinances. In fact, we are just doing some very patchy amendments. In fact, the situation in Hong Kong has been very bad, and there's a case that has not been mentioned by other members. And this is a worsening situation on discrimination against political association. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, that's because we are starting to see that the administration is taking the lead in discriminating against people for their political affiliation. What I'm referring to is the officials, including those from the Education Bureau and also the pro-establishment groups. They are actually targeting the headmasters and also teachers, because these people are accepting government funding, and therefore they are actually passing judgments on these people for their political activities. For example, well, everybody in Hong Kong has been outraged by this extradition bill, or the FOO, the Fugitive Offenders Ordinance amendments, and also the national security law, and we can see that there is already a lot of positive discrimination, and these teachers, with the oppression from the Education Bureau, will be receiving. KK Kwok, please come back to the bill. Yes, I'm moving on to that because they have not been able to give us an impression that they have been doing their job. We are actually scrutinizing the discrimination legislation miscellaneous amendment bill 2018. So please do allow me to complete this. Okay, as you can see, the administration has completely turned a blind eye to discrimination on grounds of political affiliation. Not only has it not done anything to ease the problem, in fact, they're actually taking the lead in suppressing these people. It's not just for teachers, social workers, and so on. Well, you're digressing, and if you continue to do that, I'll be telling you that you have breached the rule. Okay, so that's by way of history, and that's regrettable. And on this occasion, we're discussing this discrimination legislation bill 2018, and the most important part is about discrimination against breastfeeding women. And as a medical doctor, I can see that over the years, the administration has never taken any action to allay or to resolve this problem of discrimination against breastfeeding women. So every time the situation was so serious, it's just a simple issue of protecting women who are breastfeeding their newborn babies, and yet very little has been done. And recently, a human resource group conducted a study, and they found that out of those respondents who need to breastfeed their babies, over 60% felt that in the course of breastfeeding their babies, they have not been able to get fair treatment. And for those who felt that they had been discriminated against, up to 30% of the respondents said that. And I can give you an example. There was a woman who was breastfeeding her baby, and in her office, the human resource senior management saw that she was breastfeeding her baby, and then she was asked for how much longer do you have to breastfeed your baby. So this is a very fundamental right of a woman. That is in her workplace, in her office, she was doing this, and yet she was subjected to such treatment. And for many years, we've been talking about this policy on breastfeeding, and still we have this situation. And there was an air crew, and she's a woman, and during her breaks, she tried to express milk for her newborn baby. And then on board of the aircraft, her supervisor said, and I quote, "You are unprofessional." So that was what her supervisor said to her. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. In the workplace, these are what have been happening. Many women, as they want to keep their jobs, and therefore they cannot but put up with this. And that has a lot to do with the government's existing policies. Until recently, I can give an example. Well, at government public hospitals, breastfeeding would be treated as the primary food for babies. Well, we're talking about many years, so for several decades. When a woman has a newborn baby, And then after giving birth, well, what they get would not be an encouragement to breastfeed their babies, and instead they would be given several brands of infant formula powder, so A, B, or C, from which they can choose. And then there would be a steady supply of these free samples from the manufacturers, so they would be given for free to the hospitals. And then the hospitals would simply think that well, they do not have enough time to tell or teach these new moms how they can breastfeed their babies. In fact, they would need a lot of encouragement and support. And they lack the knowledge on how they can breastfeed their babies, and very often the nurses or the hospitals would take an easy way out by giving them this infant formula powder. And then it's only after several decades of negotiation with the HA, and finally we have been able to convince the HA so that it would no longer give free infant formula powder to these new moms. But then unfortunately, after they have been discharged from the hospital, when there is no further support, then in the workplace and in many other premises, if there is no support whatsoever, then the only thing that they could do is to give up on breastfeeding, and then they will pick up the milk bottle again. Also, as we have seen, under the legislation, such facilities, well, for example, baby care rooms and so on, in fact, they've been doing a very slow job. You cannot believe that in public hospitals, for example, in the obstetrics ward, there isn't even a single baby care rooms. So when you go back for follow-up consultation, whether it's the GOPD or special or SOPD or hospitals, well, you won't be able to find a single baby care room within the entire building. So these are the flaws, or disproportionate lack of policy support. Is not an isolated incident. And of course, all along, the administration has been giving this a very low priority. And as a result of that, even now, after we've been able to pass this bill so that we can afford better protection for breastfeeding moms, we will still not be able to afford any substantial protection to them. The law says that no one is allowed to harass these breastfeeding women. In reality, in public places, when these women try to breastfeed their babies, they would be subject to a lot of harassment and discrimination. For example, going to the shopping center or Chinese restaurants, or even some public places, for example, for follow-up consultation at the clinics. And if you try to replace your ID card, or if you go to some of the offices of the SWD, well, they have no alternative but to breastfeed their babies in the eyes of the public. And the administration has not been doing anything to encourage breastfeeding. So it has adopted this ostrich's approach in doing this. And of course, it is still better to have this amendment bill than nothing, because if you break the law, then at least we can take up prosecution against you. But then the problem is, how are you going to enforce it? Who is going to enforce it? And for these women, they are employees of these premises, and when their supervisors try to adopt this soft approach in discriminating against them, in other words, they would not be directly saying that, well, I'm discriminating against you. They might just be staring at you, or if your promotion opportunities have been deprived, or continuing studies opportunities have been deprived of you, then what can they do? What kind of support would be given by the administration? Other than having this amendment bill, will they be able to take, say, class action like that available under the Consumers Council Ordinance? Well, this is really very doubtful. Recently, we received a case. Earlier on, I got a complaint. And because of the lack of sign language interpretation, we ended up having a tragedy. And a woman who was discharged from the Pt1 hospital, and within 24 hours, she took her own life by jumping from a building. And the EOC would tell her that, sorry, in such a complaint, we will have to have the complainant before us. So how are you going to ask a deceased person to be present as the complainant? So just by passing this amendment and then to suggest that this means that the administration has already done all it could, this is self-deception. You're deceiving the women, and you're also deceiving those in the community who think that the administration has already started to support breastfeeding, and also it is going against discrimination. They only have words. There is no action at all. So with only the amendment bill, without the policy support, without the sufficient manpower to support it, by just enacting this piece of legislation, is not going to change the past discrimination practices or discriminative practices, and the public's ignorance about these ordinances will remain unchanged. So we will have to have an administration who is working hard instead of just amending the legislation.
Mr. Vincent Chang. Thank you, President. First of all, I think we should all ask ourselves first if we could discriminate others when we talk about anti-discrimination ordinances. You can't just keep on pointing the finger at the government and try to magnify what the government has not done. This is a very important issue, and I hope that we would all come back to this topic. I need to declare that I'm an EOC member, and I speak in support of the Discrimination Legislation Amendments Bill. We hope to plug the loophole and also to try to work on the recommendations that are seen of higher priority. Although I haven't been in EOC for a very long time, the EOC is really binded. They really do not have much to work on. They're very restrictive, and there are many things that cannot be done within their ordinances. And secondly, some people would abuse the ordinances under the EOC. For example, some shops would display a sort of discrimination display on their shop windows, and when the EOC says that it doesn't constitute a discrimination, then they think that they can also continue to do it. I myself, as a father, and respect mothers because many of them, in order for their baby's health, would breastfeed their children. From 51% in 1998, now we can see that about 108% of mothers discharged from hospital would choose to breastfeed. And you can see that the number of breastfeeding mothers have also raised from 6% in earlier to 28% in 2018. Hong Kong is an international city. However, we do not have enough protection in our legislation to protect breastfeeding mothers from being discriminated. Now, hardware, software, and even the attitude of the people still need to improve. Many mothers tell us that it is very difficult to persist in breastfeeding. There are not too many baby care rooms in public places for breastfeeding. Even if some malls offer such facilities, you will need to wait in line for use of the baby care room. And if you want to hide in a corner to breastfeeding, someone might complain, saying that it's actually a sort of sexual harassment or nuisance. The maternity leave has not changed for many years. It's still 10 weeks. Helena Wong is supporting maternity leave to be extended to 14 weeks, and it has not yet been passed. I really hope that it can be passed as soon as possible. We do not see enough facilities for breastfeeding mothers. There are not individual baby care rooms, and there are no breastfeeding discrimination protection. The discrimination ordinance has been in effect for over 29 years. Anti-discrimination ordinances should change with times and to have amendments made. This time, our amendments expressly provides that there should not be any discrimination against breastfeeding. Although we are a bit outdated compared to other Asian countries, it is better to be late than never. We should not make empty talk and really should take action. Therefore, I believe that there is a need to make such amendments. However, this is only the first step. Not only do we need legislation, we also hope that the government and also organizations would provide a better environment for mothers to breastfeed more easily. In recent years, I think people in Hong Kong have become more civilized, and many of them are in support of pregnant mothers. And there have been more support for new mothers. But last year, Ms. Claudia Mo discriminated directly Ms. Yong Ho Yan when she was pregnant last year. I think this is very wrong, and we still have not really condemned Claudia Mo for her actions. I hope that we would act as a good role model. I submit this bill. Thank you.